Hi, Misha here, and recently really did a deep dive into the U.S. Army's M3 fighting knife or combat knife. Interesting piece that inspired a family of knives, bayonets that we're using to this very day. And while it was inspired by older versions like the Mark I from World War I, the trench knife, and to some extent the K-bar, although this is not a utility knife, it's its own thing. The blade is a little under 7 inches, about 6 3/4. Overall length is just under a foot. And depending on the exact version and variant, this can really be very light and handy because it was designed for paratroopers. We're talking 10-11 ounces at its lightest. And it's very famous scabbard. This is actually pretty late production M8 A1, also still in service today. However, these were only built for about 18 months, and in that time they turned out just shy of 2,600,000. It had pros and cons we talked about in the first video. But the M1 Carbine, that's the subject of today's video, where we're at. Getting it a bayonet, which was much more of a task, much more of a chore than you might think. And an ongoing project that lasted through at least Korea. But before we dive in, if you could, please like, share, and comment. And if you'd like to help support us, check out Patreon. With that, let's talk about how this turned into this, and even this. Today, we really don't appreciate what a revolutionary idea the M1 Carbine was in 1940, 1941. But it was very ambitious. And it was already being adopted before the war, but after Pearl Harbor, it was rushed into the field. So some features were suspended, dropped, stuck for another day. One was select fire. Yeah, originally the M1 was meant to be select fire, but it was just self-loading, so it could get out there later, being the M2, M3. Another feature was a way to mount a bayonet to it. Yeah, they thought about it as early on as they could, and they did mess around with various concepts, various prototypes, kind of all again inspired by the trench knife from the First World War, other things going on. But it wasn't that big of a priority. So instead, they said, we'll issue the M1 Carbine, and we'll just issue the M3 knife alongside it. And that's what happened. The M1 Carbine started to go into the field in 1942, and the M3 quickly went into the field in 1943. So they served alongside each other. However, very early on, the powers that be back stateside noticed that some inventive troopers were finding ways to stick pokey things on the end of their M1 Carbines. Originally, they were really concerned about its lightweight barrel. Didn't know how it would put up with bayonet fighting, but keep in mind, a lot of these are going to the Pacific areas where it might be useful. So, in 1943, they revisit the idea of how do we put a bayonet on the carbine. Keep in mind, though, there's no lug. The barrel band we know and love today does not exist yet. So what they were going to do was clamp it to the barrel with a thumb screw, a wing nut. And they would actually do this with the M1 Carbine's grenade launcher. Yes, there was one. And later the flash hider, the conical flash hider for the M3 was used with the wing nut, and the muzzle brake of the M2 wing nut. So that's where they started. They had actually 3 well-known prototype concepts, the T4, T5, T6, and all had kind of a block with a wing nut to clamp it onto the barrel. Cool. The T5 and T6 had pig stickers about this long, and they were very much inspired by the Enfield number 4 Mark I that Britain was using, the tent staker. The T4, though, pretty much used this blade and just in the back had the wing nut block. That was the preferred version, but upon testing, the wing nut just wasn't holding up for hand-to-hand combat. The kind of forces and torque in bayonet fighting, it's different than grenade launching and all that. So they liked the T4, but it wasn't quite there yet. So, late 43, early 44, the T8 came out. Essentially, they just said, screw it, we'll take the M3, give it a new butt plate, as they called the end piece, a new crossguard hilt with the muzzle ring, and a new latch. They would have done this earlier, except it also meant the M1 Carbine would need a new barrel band. This would eventually be the T4 band. Interestingly, by the time it was ready to go in production, only Inland and Winchester were still making M1 carbines. Yeah, most of the makers, their contracts ended or were canceled by mid-1944. So by the time the T4 band was ready to go, they were the only ones going, sorry, I don't have a carbine out here at the cabin with me. I almost brought one out, but, you know, room in the car. But you know what they look like. So they knew it was going to be a modification of the gun. But it was a much better system. But originally the T8 only had one of these two springy things. And yes, we'll talk about the color of this very soon. But during testing, they thought, you know, one retaining latch, it just wasn't strong enough, dependable enough. So they added a second latch in a style and pattern we're kind of familiar with the M16, M4 Bayonet even today. So dual. So if one failed, the other one's there, again, a recoil. The modified T8 went through testing spring of 1944 and was officially accepted as the Bayonet M4 for the M1 Carbine May 10, 1944. And already by June, makers of the M3 were told to cease production. Things are going to be changing. By July, so right after D-Day, the M4 appeared in the field. And by August, the final M3s were delivered. So these were in the field. As early as September of 44, we know that. But the T4 barrel band, they're not out there yet. So in the beginning, these were used as fighting knives. And that's not my supposition. Manuals of the time say that. Let's talk about the silver elephant in the room. I don't know. I think this one's kind of neat. It's actually a ceremonial honor guard or parade one that was chromed by the military. And otherwise, it's a good example of a World War II Imperial. So, I don't know. It amused me, so I brought it out. And this would make a perfectly good fighting knife. If anything, maybe even a little better than the M3 because the butt here, it's got a little more weight to it. It does make it a little more rear heavy, though. We do have the ring, which can serve as a thumb guard, replacing the curved piece here. So there's really no compromise of this being used as a fighting knife. And the changes at first look really simple from the M3. New piece here, bada boom, bada bang, Bob's your uncle, right? Of course not. This is the U.S. military we're talking about. Well, they found making the crosspiece easy enough. This butt plate, as they called it, not so much. The latches, the way it was cut. These were made from either forgings or bar stock, according to the interwebs. Either way, you get the idea. They're asymmetrical. They're not the easiest thing to machine. In fact, A few companies tried making these, and of course, a lot of companies made the M4 type during the war. The usual suspects: Imperial, Case, Camillus. Also, Ariel enters the chat at this point. Utica, others. But most all of them, as a subcontractor, used Standard Products, who also made M1 carbines, for that matter, to make this piece, because it just required special machining, know-how, tooling, because it had to be right. It couldn't be off a bit, because if so, this would mount weird, and forces would be off whack and stress. You get the idea. My point, I hope it comes across. Early on, though, these were only, like I said, used as fighting knives. But even then, they found a few issues. Namely, this is held on with a couple of pins, and by late 44, 45, they'd noticed these pins were walking out. So an order came down to crimp them in place by 45. So that was relatively easy to fix. And that really gets into the whole construction of the M3, M4, and the stacked washers and all that. Yeah, a lot of times the M3s, when they got damaged, they just chunked them. But with this being a bayonet with a more expensive construction behind it, they had to repair them, and that's why they did that. Again, kind of according to the internet, the only major noteworthy use of the M4 as an actual bayonet on the M1 carbine would have been 1945 with Okinawa, a few of the other campaigns in the late Pacific theater, but really it was just mostly used as a knife. But it was finally a bayonet, which is why, as we talked about kind of in the first video, the M8 became the M8A1 scabbard, where they added the hanger to connect with the 1910 style web gear, ammo carriers, that kind of thing. When they did that, they extended out the strap, and that was World War II. Production would end August of 1945. Obviously, the war's over, and the various companies that built these turned out about 1.4 million M4 bayonets. Most of them just switching directly from the M3, the summer of 44. A few new ones brought on board. But of course, peacetime things change. But peace would not last long. The Korean War, 1950, kicks off. And by 51, Springfield is being assigned to really reevaluate a lot of bayonets and web gear. Here's an example. I've noticed some think that the leather grip M4 was only made during World War II. No, Camillus had a contract in 53, about 166,000 pieces running through 54 to make new ones. And there are a few minor updates. The butt is still forged, bar stock, still the leather grips. By this point, you don't really see blued blades. I believe they're pretty much all phosphated. But the difference here is the crossguard. It's thicker, chunkier. As I said, the M4 was not actually used as a bayonet much in World War II. Therefore, a deficiency wasn't really spotted until Korea. Because of the shape and how the ring sticks out, when it was being used in harsh environments, bayonet use, it was cracking, bending, all that. So Springfield evaluated what was going on, and around 1952, they developed a reinforced, heavier, thicker, stronger crossguard hilt. And that would be what Camillus would use in their 53-54 run. So designed at Springfield, used by Camillus. And you might be wondering why new production when they had so many. Obviously, World War II M4s were reissued, and they did consider simply converting M3s, new pieces. And Springfield looked at this, and in April of 52, they put out a report saying, look, it's going to cost just as much to refurbish old, possibly worn out knives as it is to just make new ones. That said, Camillus did have a test run of converting them, and there was a contract for a Japanese company, I forget the name, to convert a lot of these ended up going to South Korea. So there were limited numbers of converted M3s to M4s at this period, but now they just did new production. But of course the Korean War ended, so the Camillus ones were kind of the last of the first generation. And I think they're kind of neat because there are changes here. Also, the latches were slightly changed. They were made to stick out just a bit more and given more of a textured finish, just easier to use, what have you, especially with gloves. As for the M8A1 scabbard, Victory Plastics, VP, would get another contract in '53. And these would be slightly modified. The hangers would go from being blackened steel to phosphated, parkerized. And the metal plate that's in here that connects the canvas to the throat, to all this, it was actually extended out just a bit from what was before. Can't really see it. You can see the rivetings of it. And that was to work with newer bayonet models like the M5, which outside of the scope of this video, but few small changes to the scabbard. However, the story is only half complete. Even though the Korean War is over, even though there have not been any new M1 carbines built in nearly a decade, in the summer of 1954, Imperial gets a contract to build a little under 45,000 M4 bayonets. Almost a kind of test run. Again, originally we started off with the World War II pattern. Then the Camillus pattern would go to the Springfield reinforced crossguard. But this is still an expensive part to make back here. And these leather washers, while they're very cool, do deteriorate. And the whole thing is just hard to disassemble to replace them. Those pins are staked in place. You get the idea. So we come to the second pattern here. And at first you might just think, well, they went from leather to plastic grips. True, but that actually changed a lot more than you'd think. Instead of being stacked on to the grip portion, these are now just used with screws. That means you just remove them from the sides. And that allowed them to finally pin and stake the crossguard in place. Before that had to be removable for working purposes. Because even with the reinforced pattern, as the leather would compress, swell, this would shift around. Pinning it in place made this much sturdier. It also saved it from putting undue pressure on the leather, no longer there. So yeah, they pin it on. By this point, these are all going to be phosphated. But also back here, we have a new style of making the butt plate. Instead of a forging or bar stock, this is actually made with a sintering process, not C-E-N, but S-I-N turing. This is kind of a predecessor of MIM. It's a compressed metal powder. So, type of casting, much easier to do with especially the technology of the 1950s. That's what makes this up. Now, Imperial was first, but soon Turner would get a large contract to make at least 300,000. And when I say make, it seems like Turner was an assembly house for the M4 bayonet because they used a lot of subcontractors. For example, the Turner blades were still from Camillus, and it went from there. Moving forward, 1960s, so still pre-Vietnam War, Victory Plastics gets another major contract to make M8A1 scabbards, and this is when the metal nose appears. Also, they went from using the rawhide leather thong to tie it to your leg to the essentially belt, the boot lace cloth one. In addition, they reversed the direction of the button. Notice these two point this way. This one goes this way. And actually, the M3 here is in a leather style as well because it points that way. Yeah, not exactly sure why they did that, just ergonomics, but makes them very easy to spot. So that was the major contract there. And that would actually be Victory Plastics' final run of M8A1 scabbards, but not the final for all this. Another company new to this, Conetta, would get a contract around 65, 66, and they would make them through 68, 69, when frankly the company went out of business. So they were gone. And pretty much the same as the other ones. And the last one the U.S. government let out was to a company called Brendan in 1970-71, and this production run would run up through 72. Of course, at this point, a lot of these contracts are for foreign customers or just to give away because M1s, M2s are still going as Lend-Lease, South Korea, South Vietnam, Greece, what have you. Because by this time, the U.S. military has moved away, doing its own thing. But you see, the M4 had quite the post-war life, and many would still be around 70s, 80s. How many were made? I don't know exactly. Numbers are a little iffy. But 2.1 million. Some sources say as high as 2.5. But the thing is, are they just counting U.S. manufacture or overseas M4 bayonet copy manufacturer? I don't know. The point is, more were technically made in the post-World War II era than the pre. Meaning that, yeah, the second pattern, while it is cool, is the most common. But what's neat, if you look at this one here, the latest one I've got out on the swing, the blade and everything, I mean, it's the same. The blade didn't change. And they even kept the leather grip longer than you might think. And a few changes in production styling to the M8, M8A1 scabbard, but essentially they're all interchangeable. That's why I think it's kind of a cool heritage and family. And it doesn't stop here. But that's for, I guess, the next video in this impromptu series, when we'll talk about serving a different M1 and a, at the time, theoretical future .30 light rifle gun, and beyond that. Again, appreciate you hanging out. This isn't everyone's cup of tea. Just a nice day to sit outside, so I'm glad you sat out with me. And you know, the nice thing about collecting bayonets, no FFLs, no 4473s, no background checks. Still a lot of fun. And even if bayonet prices are on the rise, well, so are gun prices, and they're still a lot cheaper. Again, sorry for not having a M1 out at the cabin, but, you know, at least I had the bayonets, right, guys? So let me know what you think. Do you own any of the interesting variants? There are some pretty rare ones out there. I think the aerials are kind of cool. Utica, I haven't mentioned it much, but they were also involved. But as always, if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. Like to help support us, check out Patreon. With that, I think I've worked enough for today. I'm going to go have some fun. This is Misha. Catch you very soon.